gang made up of Elvin Creepy Carpus, remember prisoner St. Paul, and whatever Barker boys happened to be out of prison at the time. But before we talk about the gang, we have to address the gang's legend of the Barker's mother, Ma Barker. Many of you are probably familiar with Ma's legend because it goes something like this: that Ma was this mastermind, gun-toting criminal who took her young, innocent boys off on a life of crime, turning them into killers. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We know Ma traveled with her boys. She had to have known they were criminals, but she had no active role in the participation or planning of the crimes. We will catch up with Ma a little bit later down in Florida, and you'll see how the legend of Ma Barker began. But where she lacked in her criminal intent, her kids more than made up for it. What Carpus was doing running with the Barker boys, I don't know. Carpus was thought to be the most intelligent gangster of all time. So why he was chumming with the Barkers, who, let's just say, were not the most intelligent, maybe that's why he loved them. I don't know. But when they came to Minnesota, trouble seemed to follow them. You might recall this was the gang that in 1933 kidnapped William Ham of the Ham's Brewing fortune. They kept him for a $100,000 ransom. Quite a sum of money back then. They treated him well. They didn't hurt him physically. They fed him. They even brought him beer. It wasn't Ham's. They didn't want to torture the poor guy, but then they let him go after getting the ransom. 6 months later, they took Edward Bremer from the Bremer banking fortune, kept him for a $200,000 ransom. But they didn't consider themselves kidnappers. They thought it was beneath them. They were bank robbers. That's what they loved doing. And they robbed quite a few Minnesota banks, including in Redwood Falls in September of 1932. You can see they robbed the bank here. They pulled up right out in front of the bank, waiting to rob it. And they went inside. Immediately, the alarms were triggered. This is what it looks like at the back today. But in the back, it used to be an alleyway with a bunch of businesses in it. And as they were loading out money through the back door, one of the gangsters, we don't know which one of the Barker Carpus gang, was keeping an eye out on the back door when one lady stuck her head out of her shop and yelled to a friend who was another shop owner down in the alleyway and said, "They're robbing the bank. They're robbing the bank. If I had a phone, I would turn them in and call the police." At that point, one of the gangsters stuck his head out the window and said, "Now, you wouldn't really call us in, would you?" Needless to say, both of those women went back to their stores and they waited for the authorities to arrive. We know everything that happened in this robbery because one of the tellers in the bank, she typed up a firsthand account what had taken place of them taking hostages, putting people on the floor. The bank is still there. Many businesses have come and gone. It is no longer a bank, but they scooped up tens of thousands of dollars, and you can still go to the bank and see the night deposit vault and the other vault in the back if you so choose. But my favorite robbery of the Barker Carpus gang, if favorite is indeed the correct term, is the Third Northwestern Bank. They decided to rob this place December 16, 1932. And they robbed it not knowing that it had full glass windows and was sat on the corner of Hennepin and Central Avenue, two very busy streets in Minneapolis. But again, whether they didn't know this or they didn't care, maybe they were bored with their lives, even though they were bank robbers. They ended up robbing the bank, getting in a shootout with the local police. Both of the officers ended up dying from their gunfight with the Barker Carpus gang. But the bank robberies and the kidnappings provided them money that they could pay off the police and politicians to have protection in safe homes all over Minnesota. This safe home is still in St. Paul on South Robert Street. They were renting this home out from the landlady next door. Unfortunately for them, the landlady they were traveling as musicians with their mother, and the landlady happened to have a son who worked at a speakeasy. And one night it was pretty slow. He happened to be flipping through an old detective magazine when all of a sudden he saw a wanted poster for those musicians living next to his mother. He closed up shop, went down to the police station and said, "The Barker Carpus gang's living next to my mother. I'm here to collect the reward." They put him in a back room, said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of this with one phone call. You're going to be a hero." Unfortunately, word got to Big Tom Brown, perhaps the most corrupt police officer in Minnesota history. But even though he was corrupt, he was a man of his word. He said he'd take care of it with one phone call, and he did. But guess who he called? The Barker Carpus gang. They had no idea it was a wanted poster that had done them in. They thought it was Ma's boyfriend, Arthur Dunlop. He was an alcoholic, and when he drank and got intoxicated, he often bragged about the exploits of the gang. So the Barkers thought he was too hot for Minnesota. They had to get him out of the state. Why not take him on a nice little vacation to northern Wisconsin? But this wasn't the type of vacation you'd want to go on, because this was one of those vacations you didn't come back from. They brought him up near Siren in the Webster area to a place called Fremstead Lake. There, they shot him several times, dumped a bunch of money on his naked body to make it look like a gang hit. Years later, after retiring, the local sheriff used to jokingly claim that this was the most profitable case he never investigated. They didn't care. It was just another dead gangster. In fact, when I dug up Dunlop's death certificate, they had to list his occupation, which is about halfway down on the left side of your screen when they put unknown, suspected underworld character. Kind of a cool title to have back then, although usually it meant you'd be dead on the side of a lake. It was also in Wilmer they decided to rob banks. This time, it was not the Barker Carpus gang. July 1930, the Bank of Wilmer. Gangsters went inside and ordered everybody to the ground. Here's one of the bankers reenacting for the newspaper how he was able to trigger the alarm when the gangsters had him on the ground. One of the biggest misconceptions about bank robberies of this era was the whole stick 'em up. That's the last thing gangsters wanted. Most banks had front windows, meaning anybody who walked by would see that everybody had their arms up and they would alert the authorities. Instead, they threw people on the floor where nobody could see them. So the alarm was triggered right away. But the townsfolk, they didn't wait for the authorities to show up. They started shooting at the gangsters from downtown. All of a sudden, a shootout began. The gangsters were shooting up local vehicles and at locals. The locals were shooting back at them. The authorities said it was a miracle that dozens of people were not killed in this gunfight that seemed something out of the Wild West. The gangsters scooped up as much money as they could from the holdup and took off. At first, nobody knew who exactly the robbers were. Years later, it was thought that they were made up of at least Machine Gun Kelly, Vern Miller, and Sammy Silverman. We know Silverman was there because not long after this bank robbery, he was found dead near Matamidi, Minnesota, by the old Wildwood Amusement Center there, where his body was dumped along with several others. And it was thought that he tried to double cross some of the bank robbers and steal their share. Back in Wilmer, they have the bank is still there. It's now an accounting firm. But if you use a speakeasy password, they might let you see the old bank vault, which is still on display. For many years, the town had a reenactment of the bank robbery where they celebrated their unique and strange history. I don't believe they're doing it any longer, though. When the gangsters weren't robbing our banks and kidnapping us, they liked to relax at all the speakeasies that were all over Minnesota. Speakeasies during Prohibition were places you could go and illegally drink, gamble, dance the night away, maybe partake in one of the ladies of the night that worked at these establishments. And they were everywhere in Minnesota. I mean, everywhere. You had so many speakeasies in your state that I think in Minnesota, Prohibition was more of a suggestion than it was a law because they were everywhere. And one of their favorite speakeasies was a place that you can make your favorite speakeasy. It's the old Wabasha street caves in St. Paul. Started out as a mushroom factory and turned into a speakeasy that the gangsters loved. One of my favorite stories happened in sometime in the late 20s, early 1930s. Like all good legends, nobody knows the exact origin of it. It was said that 4 men were playing cards late at night. The waitress went to refresh their drinks, and when she was gone, she heard the sound of a Tommy gun going off. She had thought it was odd because all of the men carried large musical instrument cases, although none of them played in a band. As soon as the Tommy gun sound went off, she rushed back to find 3 of the men were dead. The man with the gun was running out of the building. Immediately, she notified the police. They came and said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of this." 1 hour later, they brought her back to the spot. They said, "If you waste our time anymore, we're going to arrest you." You see, they had cleaned up the bodies and blood as though nothing had happened. The waitress said the bodies were not removed from the caves. They were simply buried in the back of the caves, where legend is they still are to this very day. And even though everyone knew the police were corrupt, nobody believed this young woman's story, except she had proof. Above the fire mantle were the bullet holes from that card game gone awry. But the best story came in 1934. There was a dance going on at the street caves. A woman was approached to dance by a stranger. Normally, she wouldn't have accepted, but something about the man's confidence really intrigued her. She had a dance, and when the dance was over, the man and his buddies left. Immediately, everyone came running over to her, asking if she knew who she was dancing with. She had no clue. Well, in 1934, the last person in the world you'd want as your dance partner was exactly who was there. None other than John Dillinger, public enemy number 1. If you forgot Dillinger's story, he was a bank robber from 1933 to 1934, perhaps the most infamous bank robber. They used to show his wanted poster in front of movies like trailers are shown today. And believe it or not, a lot of people would stand up and start cheering for Dillinger like he was some sort of folk hero. But regardless of what you make of Dillinger, when he came to Minnesota, he liked to raise a little trouble. First stop, March 1934, the Lincoln Court Apartments in the Twin Cities. Dillinger's there with his girlfriend, Evelyn Billy Frechette. They're staying there under the guise of being Mr. and Mrs. Carl Hellman. They were renting a 3rd-floor apartment. Unfortunately for them, the landlady, like everyone in America, had gangster fever. We're on the lookout for every gangster everywhere. So the landlady thought it was odd that the couple and their friends only left through the back door. They only left at night, it seemed, and they kept the curtains pulled regardless of whether it was day or night. She notified the police. They came to check it out. Nothing out of the ordinary, another false alarm. But then they went back the next day just in case Dillinger had escaped them so many times, they weren't taking any chances. So they knocked on door 303, and Billy answered as far as that little chain lock would allow her to. They said, "We're here to speak with your husband, Carl." Momentarily forgetting her alias, she said, "Carl who?" This immediately caught their attention. She said, "Oh, my husband's at work. You have to come back later." They said, "We'd like to speak with you." She said, "I'm not properly dressed," without missing a beat. "You'll have to come back." Now they knew something was weird. They said, "We'll wait for you." They sent an officer to go find a payphone to call for reinforcements. Meanwhile, Billy shuts the door, locks it, and goes over to Dillinger and says, "The feds are here. What are we going to do?" Apparently, as cool and calm as ever, Dillinger said, "Pack your bags. We're getting out of here." Meanwhile, unfortunately for the officers, a fancy car pulls up and out gets Homer Van Meter, Dillinger's right-hand man, a very deadly character. He's going up to see Johnny and Billy. So he goes up to the third floor, sees the police are already there, and he doesn't panic. He just simply walks right by them. Finally, they think, "We should see who this guy is." They say, "Hey, who are you?" He said, "I'm a soap salesman." He's walking the entire time. "Where are your samples?" He's on the steps going down. "They're in my car," he shouts up. Finally, they send someone down. Van Meter's hiding under the stairs, jumps out, shoots at the officer who runs for his life. Meanwhile, Van Meter scurries off and gets away. Dillinger opens up the cracked door, puts his gun into the hallway, and blasts a path that allows him and Billy to escape out the back door. But Dillinger had been shot. Researchers of that era believed that his own bullet ricocheted into his calf and he needed medical attention. But he was the most wanted man in America. He simply couldn't walk into a hospital. Luckily, the upstanding city of Minneapolis had him covered. This was the home of Dr. Clayton May, a mob doctor at night, reputable doctor by day. He would treat the gangsters for their bullet wounds and stabbings and STDs at the time. Dr. Clayton May realizes it's Dillinger and says, "You can stay here as long as you want, Johnny." Of course, his fee skyrocketed as well. Dillinger stayed a couple nights, and then on the third night, he took off in the middle of the night with Billy for his home state of Indiana. Somehow, in all that confusion, Dillinger forgot to pay his medical bill. But don't worry, Dr. Clayton May would get more than a medical bill. He was found out to have helped Dillinger. He was put on trial at the Landmark Center, which was back then the federal court building, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for aiding Dillinger, and he lost his license to practice medicine. As you can see, there's a for sale sign out in front of the house. I keep my eye on this property because every once in a while it does come on the market. So if you're looking to own a piece of Minnesota's weird history, or maybe you need a place to start your makeshift underground clinic, you may want to keep an eye out for this place as well. But the gangsters couldn't go on forever. Death caught them, and it caught them very quickly. First stop, Manitowish Waters, Wisconsin, right where my car popped that tire. April 1934, which meant it was the off season, completely dead up there. It wasn't filled with Chicago tourists like it is today. So the owners were very excited when a group of men pulled in, wanting to rent the place for the entire weekend. Money was no object. In fact, the owners said the men were throwing around money as though they had just robbed a bank. But that should have been their first clue. But again, they needed the business. They were excited. But that excitement soon turned to fear when they noticed who walked through the front door. Because in 1934, this was a who's who of gangsters. Dillinger in your top left, Babyface Nelson on your top right. Bottom right, Tommy Carroll. The middle, Three-Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton, and on your bottom left, Homer Van Meter. Again, very, very deadly men. If the FBI could capture these men, they could throw away their most wanted list. Of course, they had the softer side with them, the malls as well. In the beginning, the owners were excited. The men were tipping really well. They were buying all the rounds. They were telling amazing stories. The only thing that bothered the owners is that the men all seemed to have a large lump on the side of their jackets. But don't worry, they would make the mistake and figure out what those lumps were because they smuggled out information that Dillinger was in the Northwoods. They got word down to the Chicago FBI division, which was run by Melvin Purvis. He flew into Rhinelander, Wisconsin, and they met at Voss's Birchwood Lodge, just south of Little Bohemia. They were about to make their game plan as to how to capture Dillinger when they got word that instead of leaving the next morning as planned, Dillinger was about to take off at any moment. He had an uncanny knack of knowing when things weren't quite right. So the FBI could only race over and wait for Dillinger to come out and try to shoot him on sight or capture him. Unfortunately, a little after 9 p.m. when they got there, 3 local men who had been eating and drinking that night at the lodge went out to their car to go home. The federal government panicked. They thought it was Dillinger. They opened fire on this vehicle, killing one of the men, injuring the other 2. Well, now chaos erupted at Little Bohemia. Babyface, who was staying in the side cabin because nobody wanted him in the main room, he could have easily snuck into the night undetected. Instead, he came out guns blazing, and later he ended up killing an FBI agent and shooting many other people in the Northwoods. But this gave Dillinger and his time enough time to escape all the bullets that were being shot into the building. The government was shooting up the place, but Dillinger had an elaborate escape plan. And that escape plan was this. They crawled out the back window. The federal authorities, while trying to capture the most elusive men in the world, did not know there was a ravine by the lake that the gangsters could run undetected. Tommy Carroll simply hitchhiked his way back to the Twin Cities. Meanwhile, Dillinger took off running with Three-Finger Jack and Homer Van Meter. At gunpoint, they were able to borrow a car from a local man. They wanted to make their way through to the Twin Cities, but again, the North was too hot because every radio station in America was broadcasting stories of Babyface shooting up the Northwoods. So they couldn't come through the Morris type area. They had to go through the southern town of Hastings, Minnesota. So they went over the old spiral bridge that was there. As they crossed the bridge, police noticed that the plates were stolen. So all they could do was give a running chase again. And that's what they did. For over 20 miles, they had a police chase of the gangsters, shooting back and forth at one another. Eventually, Homer Van Meter swerved the car off the road and got away. Later, they would find the abandoned vehicle of the gangsters. Judging by the amount of blood you see photographed here, they believed whoever was sitting in the front seat would die from their gunfight. And they were right. Three-Finger Jack did die from that gunfight. Unfortunately, the old spiral bridge is gone. They have a brand new bridge leading from Hastings into St. Paul. So you can recreate the Dillinger escape if you so choose. Just make sure no officers are chasing and shooting at you as you escape into the saintly city. Imagine you're down at the Biograph Theater in Chicago when all of a sudden you look next to you and the guy sitting there looks a heck of a lot like John Dillinger. And it was Dillinger. He had no idea he was being set up by his friend, a woman named Anna Sage. She was Romanian and ran some brothels in Chicago and was being threatened with deportation. So she believed that if she could turn in the most wanted man in the world, not only would she get the reward money, the US government would have to let her stay here too. So that's what she did. She set up Dillinger. And for her reward, the US government shipped her back to Romania. Here's where things get odd. The official version of events is that Dillinger came out of the theater that night, saw the police were there, tried to run into this alleyway and shoot them, but they were just too fast and they shot him and he bled to death waiting for help to arrive. Witnesses that night tell a different version of events, saying a well-dressed man seemed to be shot without warning in this alleyway and bled to death waiting for help to arrive. Regardless of whether either of those versions are true, Dillinger lost his life in this alleyway. Immediately, thousands of people gathered under the Biograph Theater. They got Johnny, they got Dillinger. Can you believe it? But they didn't stop there. They went over to the alleyway. Now, word of caution here. You're going to see this caution sign maybe 2 more times in the program. What it means is that the next slide or two may be gory or graphic or gruesome. You might not want to see it. So if you'd rather not, close your eyes. I'll tell you when the photo's gone so you don't have to see it. Fair warning, here we go, because this is what they did in the alleyway. They dipped their handkerchief or their newspaper into the blood of Dillinger as some grisly souvenir. When they were done there, they followed him to the morgue. Women cut locks of his hair. More blood was stolen. A nearly naked photo was taken of his bloodied body. Okay, photo's gone. For years at the Biograph, they used to show on the anniversary of Dillinger's death, the very same show that he was watching when he was gunned down. But they no longer do it, so you may have to watch Manhattan melodrama from the safety of your own home. The next to go was Homer Van Meter. Not as well known as Dillinger, but it was his right-hand man. The two met in prison and spent much of their criminal lives together, so it's only fitting they would both go down in such eerily similar conditions. While Dillinger got his in an alleyway in Chicago, Van Meter got his in an alleyway in St. Paul. University Avenue. He was going to buy a car and he was dropped off with about $9,000 in cash on him. But as soon as he got out of the car, he realized the police were already waiting for him. So he ran across University Avenue into an alleyway, which ironically is now a bank parking lot. As soon as he turned in, he realized his mistake. Blind alley, dead end. But before he could do anything, they had their shotguns out and they blasted him. He fell to the ground and was bleeding to death. Witnesses say, like the true gangster he was, he went to grab his gun to fire back, but his hand had been completely blown off by the shotgun blast. He too died in the alleyway waiting for help to arrive. I'm going to show you his photo. Again, if you'd rather not see it, close your eyes. Here we go. Here's Van Meter wrapped under a blanket, dead in the alley. Well, we assume it's Van Meter. Paul Maccabee, who wrote the wonderful John Dillinger Slept Here book, tells the story that the photographer was late to the scene. They had already taken Van Meter away. So he hired someone to lie down under a sheet so he could snap the photo. So I don't know. Maybe that's Van Meter. Maybe it's not. Okay, photo's gone. Now the mystery was, how did they know he was going to be there? Was it a jilted lover, a jealous gangster? We don't know. The case was never officially solved. But here's an easier mystery for you to solve. When he went to buy his car, he had thousands of dollars in cash on him. By the time the police were done with his body and he ended up at the morgue, he had around $100 in cash on him. Where that money went to, I'll leave it up to you to solve that mystery. The next to go was Babyface Nelson. He was with his wife and John Paul Chase, leaving Wisconsin on their way to Chicago when they saw FBI agents coming up from Chicago to Wisconsin. So Babyface turned his car onto their road, ran one of them into a ditch and the other one into a park near Barrington, a Chicago suburb, northern suburb. Then he got out of his car and started walking toward them, shooting. They're shooting him, he's shooting them. By the time he reaches their vehicle, he has bullet wounds all over his body. But he realizes they're in no condition to fire back at him, so he kicks them out of their vehicle and he drives off with his wife and his good buddy following behind. Unfortunately, not long after the gunfight, both of those agents in the vehicle would die from their gunfight with Babyface. Babyface's dead body was found the next day on the side of the road. I'm going to show you his morgue photo. Again, if you don't want to see it, close your eyes. Here we go. Babyface dead in the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. The last of the big names to go was that of Ma and Fred Barker. It was January of 35. They were renting a home down in Florida near the lake. The FBI found out they were there. Now, at the time, the neighbors thought they were the best neighbors you could have. Even though they didn't know they were gangsters, they loved that they would hand out candy and coins to kids and give rides in their fancy automobile. But they had no idea they were gangsters. When the government found out, they said they knocked on the door and asked Ma to surrender peacefully, which her reply was, "Let's see what Freddie and his guns have to say about surrendering." Meanwhile, in actuality, they opened fire right away. They didn't even wait. Researchers of that time believe that Ma and Fred were killed in the first 30 seconds of the gun battle. But for the next several hours, every time the wind blew a curtain or a screen door, the government thought it was the gang shooting back at them. So they opened fire. It went on so long, people started putting out lawn chairs in the front yard, watching it like it was some reality TV show. Finally, after many hours of no gunfire coming from inside the house, the government garnered the courage to force the Barkers' hired man inside to see what was going on. And that's when they discovered Ma and Fred were dead. And that Ma was this unarmed senior with mild at best intelligence. And they thought, maybe the public would not like us going around shooting unarmed seniors. So they concocted this story of her being a mastermind criminal. Once the story spread, those who knew Ma best told the media that that old woman couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. But regardless, that's how Ma and Fred died, and that's how the legend of Ma Barker began. Last warning, close your eyes. I'm going to show you Ma and Fred's morgue photo. Here we go. Here's the bullet-riddled bodies of Ma and Fred in the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. Now, as I said, the neighbors loved them. Even when they found out they were gangsters, they named their local hideout, their local watering hole, Ma Barker's Hideaway. You can go there and do some shots or take some shots if you so choose. But besides dying, the gangster era came to an end for three reasons. One, the repeal of prohibition. Bootleggers making millions of dollars a year dried up overnight. Two, the government, the FBI in particular, got much better at fighting these men and women. And three, because of us. When they were robbing banks, no one seemed to care. When they were bootlegging, people cared even less. It wasn't until they started killing us and kidnapping us that we turned them in for the outrageous sums of money being offered. So it leaves us with the final question of, what do we make of these men and women? Were they folk heroes, killers, or something in between? That's where I leave it up to you to come to your own conclusion. But regardless of what you make of these men and women, I think what should be celebrated is the era in which they operated. Not only did they change Minnesota laws, they changed America's laws and history as well. And I think that's what should be celebrated rather than the characters themselves. So with that, if you want more information, My website, chadlewisresearch.com, has more than you could ever possibly want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here with this program. Grab one of my road guides. Go on your own adventure of Minnesota. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. But you may want to heed the advice of these next travelers, because in Minnesota, who knows what could happen. So with that, I wanted to save the last few minutes we have for any questions, comments, or stories from you. Now, again, I want to thank the library. It's very rare that you can come to a program like this at no cost, check out a wealth of information from the library. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a lot of work into getting me here, and they should be applauded, because I can't think of a time in America's history in which the library has played a more important role than it does in today's world. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, libraries are the fabric that keeps our communities together. A real treasure for any city that has one. So to help show my appreciation, if you're going to go to my website and pick up any books, just type in the coupon code library. You'll get 20% off everything, just because the library is so amazing. So with that, I'm going to toss it back to the library. I'll stop sharing my screen. If you have questions, you can either put them in the chat room or unmute yourself and ask. Or if you have comments or stories, maybe a family story of your grandpa or grandma that was a bootlegger, or maybe had a still in the backyard, as so many people in Minnesota seem to have done. So I'll stop and throw it over to the library.
Okay, so like Chad said, if you have any questions or something you'd like to share, you can either put it in the chat or unmute yourself, and we'll just take a few minutes.
And remember, this was just the tip of the iceberg. These were just the biggest name gangsters. Imagine the thousands of mom and pops who had stills everywhere. And just to show you how big of celebrities they were, down in Chicago, they set up little booths for tourists where they would sell them a little manila envelope for 5 cents or a dime. And it would be stamped rare Dillinger photo. And tourists ate it up, and they'd buy it and they'd open it and there'd be nothing in there. And they'd say, hey, this one's empty. And the clerk would say, well, Dillinger must have escaped from you too. So I thought that was pretty clever on their part, that Dillinger must have got away from you when you bought his picture. Yeah, and when they were getting their clothes laundered at Little Bohemia, the owners took the clothing into town to the woman who did all the guest clothing. But the clothes were so expensive and so nice that the laundry woman jokingly said, hey, you haven't got Dillinger over there, have you? And they did, but they couldn't say anything because Dillinger would have killed them for ratting him out.
I have a question.
Yes.
What was the name of that mayor of St. Paul that invited the gangsters to come to St. Paul?
John O'Connor. And he was so popular that he retired, and people begged him to come back to serve as the police chief. And he did. He came back and served for a while as well. And he put the program in effect that there were legends that by the 1930s, if you came to town as a tourist and you lost your wallet, if you reported it to the police, if it was pickpocketed, by noon they would have your wallet back. That's how tight of a grip they had on the crime in St. Paul. They knew every criminal and what they were doing, and they kept a very tight hand on crime inside St. Paul.
Thank you.
And up in your area, over in the St. Cloud area of Stearns County, that's where they made Minnesota 13, which was a high-end spirits. And a book came out a few years ago by the author who's now deceased, but she reported that nearly 90% of the county were somehow involved with bootlegging, and that many farms and automobile dealerships and other things were saved because of prohibition. And Minnesota 13, terrific book, by the way, but the spirits was very popular because dozens of people were dying around the country every day from drinking tainted liquor. So if you had a very high-end, safe liquor, people would spend a lot of money for it. And truckloads of grapes were going up north in Minnesota to the Italians to make their wine. Sugar was going up for the spirits that was being made. It was a wild place, unbelievable. Minnesota must have been quite the era back then.
I'm curious, Chad, if you are interested in contemporary criminals, gangsters, and what you think of, you know, what people are like now versus the historical figures.
Well, I certainly don't study modern crime, but I'm amazed at how many bank robberies still take place.
Really?
Back then, in the 20s and 30s, if you had better weapons and a faster car, you could usually get away with a bank robbery. But today, with all the technology, I'm amazed that people still do it. And one question I often get is, what's the difference between a gangster and like a mob, the mafia? And for me, the gangsters were more like freelancers, where the mafia liked to control a city or a region, and they would control everything: drugs, prostitution, the number gambling, the rackets, all that. Where the gangsters, they didn't care about that stuff. They just liked robbing banks, thrill seekers, if you will. And they often weren't stationary. They moved around all the time. So that's a bit different. And then also we have to differentiate between like Jesse James and Frank James and the outlaws of that era, because they were in Minnesota. They tried to rob the Northfield Bank among many others, but they were on horseback. It was more Wild West of their gang rather than the gangsters who were in the fastest automobiles. They had the Tommy guns and threw around money like nothing, because if they ran out, they just went and got more.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions for Chad? Oh, there's one in the chat, Chad.
Okay.
Can you see that?
Yes. Let me check my chat here. Tom Brown and Morris. Yeah, Big Tom Brown came up to the north. Eventually, he settled where a lot of people who get kicked out of the Twin Cities go, up north. He went to Ely, and he started a liquor store up there. He ran one in the Morris area as well before, but when he was older, he went up, well, much older, went up to Ely, where it's now Wildlife Liquor. It's still there on the main drag. And I spoke with the woman whose family has owned it since the day Big Tom Brown was there. And she said her grandpa always said that Big Tom Brown was a terrible human. He never paid his rent on time. He was really mean. And when he dropped dead from a heart attack on Main Street of Ely, people celebrated. And he's buried in the Ely Cemetery with his wife. You can go there and have a cocktail in his honor if you so choose. But he was one of the few people that did not get prosecuted. When the federal government came in and put wiretaps on the police, a lot of police were indicted, but somehow Big Tom Brown still had those connections that got him out of it, and he headed up north. Yes. Have I seen any of the history mentioned in popular culture? All the time. You might remember that movie came out a few years ago with that little-known actor called Johnny Depp, called Public Enemies, about the Dillinger gang. And for me, the hardest part of this research was going to these places and controlling the excitement of, you know, sitting at a bar and thinking, this is amazing. Al Capone was here, or John Dillinger was sat right here. How cool is that? But then I had to weigh that with, it wouldn't have been that cool if I was back and they were shooting at me and I was the one they were trying to kidnap. So trying not to romanticize it and look back with rose-colored glasses was the hardest thing for me doing this research, because so much time had passed. It really was cool to sit there and think some of the most notorious outlaws were right here. But at the same time, they would have killed you without thinking twice if you got in their way. So that was hard to balance that out for me. And every program I do, I weigh that am I romanticizing this too much? Am I making these people out to be folk heroes when they weren't? So I often caution people that, again, it's cool to relive the history. It's great. It's so much fun to keep these places alive. But I think we really do need to realize these weren't, the best good Samaritans that the towns ever produced. So I think as long as I keep that in the back of my mind, it's a little easier to enjoy some of these gangster hotspots. And I believe they're making Minnesota 13 again. So you may want to look into that. And there was a movie, Minnesota 13 too, based off of the book. Both are great. The library could probably find it through the library system request, interlibrary loans, whatever it's called there in the great state of Minnesota.
Yeah, we certainly can.
Yeah. So I highly recommend it. When you read Minnesota 13, or John Dillinger Slept Here by Paul Maccabee, you'll just be amazed at how many people, clergymen, were involved in smuggling, bootlegging, and oftentimes the backs of graves would be hollowed out, where the local farmers would put their booze in there and then open a door, put the booze in the gravestone, and then come back the next day and there'd be money there from the bootleggers, from the crime syndicate. So, and I mean, every big name gangster of the day, from Al Capone to George Bugs Moran, they were all in Minnesota, mainly for all the resorts that you have around the lakes. They were avid outdoorsmen. They loved to hunt and fish and get away from the heat, both literally and figuratively, down south. Oh yeah, someone's saying we have John Dillinger right there. And a couple years ago, I forget the guy who did it now, did both a CD audio tour and of both Minneapolis and St. Paul of gangster hotspots, where you put it in and go to a spot and press, song 1, and it tells you the history of what happened while you were there. I forget the guy who did it, but both of those are out there as CDs. If you still have a CD player in your car, you can take that tour. Probably download them now as well.
Probably. Anything else tonight, people? Well, then I think we should just say thank you to Chad, and don't forget to fill out the survey that's in the chat. KK's down there with a little clapping emoji. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Chad, and thanks for your kind words about libraries. We really appreciate your support. And we hope to have you back again someday.
Keep an eye out.
Thanks, everybody.